Well, good morning, everyone. I see some folks already doing this, but please introduce yourself in the chat. I'd love to know where you're coming from. I'm currently in San Antonio, Texas. And I'd also love to hear what stood out to you from this week's journey through Yevamot. It has been a week, and I'm really interested in what you all are taking from it. Oh my gosh, we have folks in all over the world. I love this. Hi, everyone. Um, and so while folks are introducing themselves, I'll sort of start with a bit of a story. So I was recently hanging out with a 3-year-old, and he is at this great stage of trying to figure out who is a good guy and who is a bad guy. And, who is that a bad guy or a good guy? And I'm going to be honest, his parents are trying so hard to, explain that people aren't good or bad, but that their actions are, all of the nuance that adults bring to the conversation. But he's at this really developmentally appropriate stage of, trying to figure out the categories that organize the world. And I kept thinking about him as we were reading the Daf this week, because this week's Daf is all about categories. And I want to remind you, right, that while it is extremely developmentally appropriate for a toddler to expect neat categories and binaries, the rabbis are not toddlers, and they recognize a much more complicated picture of the world. And I think we really see that this week when we see how the rabbis are really thinking about categories and the folks who don't quite fit the categories most of us are expecting, right? We start out this week's journey with the categories of gender and sex. Right? In a world where a man was supposed to be able to perform certain kinds of intimate acts, and to be a woman was to be both sexually mature and fertile, what do we do about the people who aren't? And I want to flag here our trusty captain through this journey, Dr. Scheinerman, has a wonderful piece on the My Jewish Learning website, which lays out the 8 categories of sex/gender that the rabbis understand. So maybe, Rachel, if you could find that and just put a link in the chat.
Sure.
I think that would be really helpful. And so we have this discussion of the people who are either sexually underdeveloped from birth, or who are eunuchs, either by the hand of God or by the hand of people. And then we have this really brief aside about the categories of viable and not viable. And those of you who live in the United States right now might be expecting, when we talk about viability, that we're talking about the fetus. But actually, for the rabbis, what they're talking about is infants that are born in the 8th month of pregnancy. And the rabbis believe that fetuses that are born in the 8th month of pregnancy are not viable. But that fetuses born in the babies born in the 7th month or in the 9th month are. And if we have some time, we can talk about maybe why that is. But I want to talk about something else today. Then we go back to this sort of destabilizing the categories of gender and sex, right? We talk about the androgynous, right? The person who has sex characteristics that are both male and female, and the tumtum, who appears to have neither. All right, so the rabbis are all about destabilizing these categories of, the various sexes or genders. And then we get into categories of Jew or non-Jew, priest or non-priest, right? We complicate things with the mamzer and the halal, right? The priest who, the person of a priestly family who is not fit to serve in the priesthood, or the woman from a priestly family. I should have said the man. Now, the woman of the priestly family who is not fit to have been a priest were she to be a man. Um, and then other messy categories like Egyptian converts in the second and third generations. Right? So the rabbis, this whole week to me has been about expectations, right? Like my 3-year-old friend being like, I want there to be neat categories, and the rabbi saying, no, thank you. Then we do this really interesting brief intermission about ritual food that gets mixed up. And I want to come back to that, but let's put a pin in the ritual food that gets mixed up. And then in Yevamot 85, we get the ultimate statement of the complications around Jewish and non-Jewish identity. So this is on 85a, and Rav Papa says, you learned it. There are 10 kinds of lineages that came back from Babylonia after the exile. Priests, okay, check. Levites, check. Israelites, we know what those are. Chalalim, right, priests who are not fit to serve. Converts, people who are formerly enslaved. Mamzers. Gibeonites, which are a particular category of people who were indigenous to the land of Canaan and then de facto converted through some pretty excellent trickery in the book of Joshua. Highly recommend if you haven't read it. Children of unknown paternity and foundlings. And just for context, just so folks know, in the ancient Roman Empire, lots and lots and lots of infants were abandoned. People who could not raise infants, people who could not, who did not want an infant, people who did not want this particular infant, were dumped pretty often. And so it was pretty common to have foundlings, right? Maybe you've heard of infant exposure or things like that. So that's what we're talking about here. And Rav Papa and then the rest of the Talmud sort of continues to talk about the legal implications for each category. Who they can marry, what they can eat, what they can inherit. For women, if they're in one category and they're engaged or married or divorced or widowed from somebody in a different category, what are the legal implications there? So really clear statement that there are at least 10 different identity categories that are relevant and part of the Jewish community, right? And Rav Papa's 10 categories who ascended from the Babylonian exile only include categories that are part of the Jewish community. So we're ignoring, right, and perhaps and not ignoring, right? It's not relevant, right? People who weren't Jewish didn't come back from the Babylonian exile, according to Rav Papa. So really complicated, but interesting. And so again, right, this thing that I just kept coming back to is the idea of these strict binaries is super important for a 3-year-old. But the rabbis, I think here, are really helpfully reminding us that just because something is age appropriate for us at the age of 3 doesn't mean that that's the fullness of the story. And in fact, the world is really complicated. And our journey through the Talmud, I hope, is reminding us that we need to recognize that and reckon with it and continue to learn what is age appropriate for us now that perhaps we are not 3. So that's sort of the broad overall sweep of this week's Daf. And I'm really curious if we could get some folks in the chat maybe to tell us what stood out to you from this week's Daf. Let's hear from some folks about what jumped out at you.
We have a couple questions about why we're on so many tangents this week that I'm seeing. I see one asking about how we ended, okay, I can see how we got from Yevamot and marriage to a discussion of genders and people who are less easy to categorize in that schema. But then how did we get to Truma and tithes? That's one question that I'm seeing. And there was another one here too about I can't put my finger on it at this moment about how we ended up in these tangents. Where did the Yavam and the Yavama end up? Where are they? Why are they gone? And are we getting back to them?
So great questions. The tangent piece I want to talk about, that like ritual food piece. Once I hear from some folks, I'm going to bring it back to that because I think that is that struck me too. In terms of the Yavama and the Yavama, they are still there. They're just waiting in the wings. We're about to have some pretty extensive conversations about them coming up. And actually, soon, we are going to finally hear how you actually do chalitza and stop being somebody's Yavama. So we are coming back to that. But before we can really talk about how to do chalitza, we really need to apparently figure out exactly who is obligated and isn't. And so understanding those categories becomes really important. So that's where we are currently. And that's what we're doing. But yes, great question. And we are coming back. We are coming back to the Yavam and the Yavama.
I think sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. Please. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I can see a lot of people really recognizing that the idea of the androgyne or the androgynous as a separate creation. And that is particularly striking. And I'm seeing some folks say that this is a degree of tolerance. Yeah, I think one thing that we often think is sort of the modern culture wars, and maybe this is just because I'm in Texas, but I think culture wars are a thing that happens all over the world, is that we, people talk about biblical values, whatever those are. And I think what we're seeing here is that Jewish values are really complicated and that the rabbis recognize a much more complicated world than perhaps we might think. And, it's interesting because I hear people use the term tolerant, and to tolerate, that might be the right word, right? We tolerate things that we don't love, but, are part of our world. I tolerate getting my allergy shots because I don't want allergies. I'm not sure, actually. I think for some of the rabbis, tolerance is perhaps what they're thinking about. But I think, active inclusion might be another way to think about this, right? If God created people to be who they are, in terms of whatever their external or internal genitalia look like, I'm not sure that we're supposed to tolerate God's creation or, celebrate it in the same ways that we celebrate all of the rest of it. I don't know. Yeah, really a recognition of individualism. I'm seeing folks here. Are there other things that struck folks in this week's journey? Every daf has a new, the number of insults, mamzer, halalash, tuki. So they seem to be muttered under the breath. So I do want to just say, I'm not sure that the rabbis think of those as insulting. They are legal categories, much like the category of minor or Jew or Levite. Now, we today, right, the term mamzer, if you're a Yiddish speaker, the term mamzer is absolutely used in Yiddish as an insult today. But it's not clear to me that every time it got used then, that it was meant as an insult, which doesn't mean we may not hear it as an insult, right? Recognition that we are not the rabbis, right? They might have understood a complicated world, but it's not our world, and we bring our full selves to this text. But
surely, though, it was undesirable. It's not something you would wish on somebody.
Well, I think for a mamzer, certainly, and we can see all of the ways that a mamzer and a halal they're working really hard to prevent those categories. But the shtuki,
which suggests it's undesirable.
Absolutely.
It's not something you want to be.
Right, but I'm saying the terminology.
Yeah.
But then the foundling and the shtuki, those are those are relatively neutral, right? I mean, I think we have, stay tuned, we're going to talk a lot more about them when we get to Tractate Kiddushin, but I think they're really just reckoning with, there are these abandoned infants that people take home, and how do we treat them? And it's not the same thing as modern adoption. Oftentimes, abandoned infants were taken home to be part of the enslaved household, and you would sort of raise them and then they would serve you. So it's not adoption, but it is complicated. And sometimes they were sort of adopted and became your children. So really.
Right. We should be careful. I see Emily's commenting on foster care. We should be careful about patting ourselves too much on the back for that. In our society, it is not like every child is raised by loving parents, or that society has a perfect solution to when that doesn't happen.
Absolutely. No, I mean, that's a really good point. And thank you, Emily. Yeah, and I think right above Emily's comment, I see somebody, Eloise, right? Eloise notes, part of what they're doing is really just trying to think about every possible permutation of things that exist in the world. And that's really, I think, this sort of totalizing vision of how the Torah can really handle everything that the world throws at it. I see Dita also has pointed out, oh wait, I lost it. Where is it? The rabbis are trying to exert some control over two tensions. Their concept of priestly, lost it again, purity, and who can eat truma, and wildly under uncontrollable human genetics. Yeah, right. And I think that's a really good reminder that the rabbis are trying to offer a totalizing vision. And at the same time, they always kind of know that the world is going to be even more complicated than they really could figure out. So it sounds like we are shifting into this concept of the truma. So let's look at that middle bit that is a little funky. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen so that everybody can see the text. But when I do that, I can't see the comments. So Rachel, if you could just be in charge of comments for a bit.
Sure. I'll keep an eye on the comments.
I can only see a certain number of things. Okay. So we in the middle of all of this discussion of categories of human identity, we get this weird aside, right? We learned in a Mishnah in Orla, which we haven't learned yet, but stay tuned. One who had bundles of clover of food crops in a vineyard must be burned. Okay, so if you have, you're not allowed to mix two different kinds of produce together, according to the rabbis. And so here, right, so we've got clover, which is one kind of plant, in a vineyard, which is grapes, and that's going to be a problem. So you have to burn them. What if the forbidden bundles, right, the clover, now becomes mixed with a bunch of other bundles of clover that were not forbidden? What do? Rabbi Meir says they have to all be burned. And the rabbis say they are nullified in a mixture of 1 part forbidden food to 200 parts permitted food. Okay, so basically, if you lose 1 bundle of clover in a huge pile of 200 parts of permitted clover, it kind of, the law of averages, it's nullified. But if it's less than 200 parts of permitted clover, you got to burn the whole thing. Okay. So Rabbi Meir then gives us this interesting sort of general rule. As Rabbi Meir would say, any object that is usual to count renders a mixture prohibited. So things that are of special importance, right, is sort of how they're thinking about this. So, right, you can buy, depending on what you buy it in different ways, right? If you go to the grocery store, there are certain things that you buy by pound, right? You're going to buy a pound of tomatoes, let's say. If I go to the grocery store here in Texas, I could buy a pound of tomatoes. On the other hand, there are other things that are bought by unit. Usually, let's be honest, those are the more expensive things, right? So if I wanted to buy an artichoke, there's a price per unit. So what Rabbi Meir is saying is that things that are bought by the pound are easy to nullify. But things that are bought by the unit because they are more expensive or more special in some way, those things don't ever get nullified in a crowd. And then the rabbis say even further, there are only 6 objects that are important enough that they cannot be nullified and render things forbidden, even if they're mixed in a huge crowd. And Rabbi Akiva says that there are 7. And then they list what those various kinds of produce are. Okay, so it's a little weird. We're talking about identity categories, and then we shift into forbidden produce, and priestly food gets mixed in with non-priestly food. I'm going to stop share right now. And then we get back to the identity categories, right? It's all a little, I don't know, it feels a little random. So, but here's sort of what I was thinking about this, right? And to be fair, right, we've sort of artificially decided that our week ends on Thursday. And so if we were meeting on Mondays, we'd have different sort of senses of, a chunk of Talmud. So I want to name that. But I think what Rabbi Meir and even the rabbis and Rabbi Akiva, right, they might disagree about which things don't nullify others, but they all agree that there are certain things, right, most items that get mixed in with each other can be nullified in a large enough mixture. But there are a certain number of things which never can be nullified in a mixture because they have inherent value as individual units. And so thinking about this part of the week's Daf in relationship to the other themes we encountered this week, to me, what I took from that juxtaposition is, what do we do when we have groups of things of the same status, and then 1 or 2 things with a different status get mixed in, right? What do we do, for example, when most people in the world have a fairly common or well-known or scientifically recognized gender or sex status, and then, or a fairly common, right, maybe we might even think simplistic Jew or non-Jew status, but then there's a minority who don't, right? Do we just nullify the differences? Do we make rules for the majority and say, like, the minority will figure it out, will be nullified in the majority? Or if they're valuable in and of themselves, if, I don't know, we might say they are in fact a creation unto themselves, to quote, our sages of blessed memory, can we not nullify them? Do we have to figure out how to change the nature of the community as a whole to recognize the kinds of differences that exist? And I want to just name, right, to me, that's incredibly complicated. But hey, so is the Talmud. So that was sort of my thinking about how this may or may not fit. Now, to be clear, I don't think that's what the rabbis were trying to say necessarily. But, much like many of you who were trying to figure out, like, what is the thread? How did we get here? To me, what I take from that is there might actually be some kind of connection or parallel there that is worth us thinking about. Laura says, I was thinking more concretely, you can separate out the number of artichokes, but not the ounces of pounds of oats. Definitely. But you can also separate out tomatoes, and those get sold by the pound. Or peaches, and those get sold by the pound, at least at my grocery store. So, complicated. I see somebody else ask, do the rabbis believe that everyone was created in the image of God? Yes, absolutely. No rabbi disagrees that all human beings were created in the image of God. However, what on earth the word image of God means is hotly debated. So, does image of God mean that one literally looks physically like in some way God looks? Probably not for the rabbis. Does it mean that you have free will, right? Rambam, Maimonides, the 11th century Jewish legal commentator, codifier, and philosopher, writes that to be in the image of God is to have a rational intellect, right? To be able to make decisions for yourself. I think there's a wonderful educator in north of me, I want to say in Dallas, Sharon Wechter, who writes that the image of God is really a command to see not yourself as in the image of God, but to see others as created in the image of God, right? And to what does it mean to assume everybody you encounter is created in the image of God? And that's a responsibility. So I think we really get a sense, everybody thinks that human beings are created in the image of God. And what the image of God means is a subject of extensive discussion in the history of rabbinic literature. Absolutely. Right. And Laura, thank you for pointing out, right? If we think about, this is, I don't know that I would make this connection, but I think people have, right? If we look at that midrash where God created the first individual as a hermaphrodite or intersex and then separated them out into two distinct sexes, well, what does that mean about, my students always imagine God as like the old man in the sky, right? Like, what does it mean for kids' pictures of the old man in the sky? Yeah, really great, really, really rich topic for discussion. We have time for maybe one more comment. Rachel, have I missed something in the chat?
Well, Dita says toward the end that this question of categorizing and struggling over categories is really relevant in a lot of modern conversations. She points to questions largely about pronouns and transgender and bathrooms and things like that. I think also, to throw another hot topic right into the crowd, I think it also very much plays into the whole discussion about abortion and like who is a fetus, right? This idea that a fetus might be something between a person and not a person is very complicated and difficult, and at least a piece of that conversation. All of this is reminding. Do you remember in grad school when we read Mary Douglas?
Yes.
Do you remember reading Mary Douglas? We read Mary Douglas in grad school together. And one of her theses is that humans have an intense need for order, which is like something I can really identify with in my house. I go crazy when things get too cluttered and out of space. And that so much of religion writ large, and she doesn't say Judaism in particular, but she is thinking a lot through the book of Leviticus, is about the need to create categories and order and make sure there's a category and make sure everything fits in that category. And I often think about her when we have these discussions about that. Why is that? I think she put her finger on like a deep human psychological need to be able to name categories and put people in categories. And I think it's always worth asking ourselves why we have that need and if we should push back a little bit on that need.
Well, and I think what's so interesting to me is the rabbis also have that need, right?
So they do, yeah.
But what they end up doing, right? Because on the one hand, you have a love of categories, and let's be perfectly honest, going back to my 3-year-old friend, right? Like the easiest number of categories is 2, but that doesn't match the world. And so the rabbis don't say, well, there are 2 categories and you either fit or you don't, or perhaps you fit, or we have to medically change you so that you fit, or we have to suppress you so that you're not part of the community, right? What they do is they say, okay, we need categories and we have this multiplicity of kinds of people. So we need to create a multiplicity of categories, right? And I think we all know there's probably still going to be some folks who don't fit. But if we think about their 10 lists, the 10 kinds of Jews who come up from Babylonia, they come up with a list of 10 kinds of Jews. If we think about Dr. Scheinerman's wonderful piece about the rabbinic sex and gender, there are 8 sexes/genders, right? I mean, the rabbis are a helpful reminder that the love of categorization doesn't mean simplification, and it doesn't necessarily mean exclusion, right? You can make more categories, right? You can, if you want to. So it's really a question of what you want to do. If you don't want to, you won't. And if you do want to, you will. Which I think takes us back to this idea that, Maimonides offers, that the image of God is to have free will. We get to make choices. And the more we know, hopefully the more thoughtful the choices we make will be.
All right, I think we're going to call it there. Thank you so much for such an interesting and wide-ranging discussion. And I think we all have a lot to think about as we go home. And I look forward to discussing this with all of you again soon. So thank you, Dr. Ronas, for steering us around a lot of pages of Talmud and giving us a lot of higher level things to think about in the process. That's no mean feat. Thank you to all of you for joining us and for your good questions and comments and participation and making us think about these things more. And we will see all of you in your inbox tomorrow. Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye.